The morning light was grey and entirely unforgiving. Sarah sat at her small kitchen table. She stared blindly at the cold cup of coffee in her hands. It was 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. The house was completely silent. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. A silence that had lived with her for exactly 2 years. 2 years since Robert took them. 2 years since the judge believed his polished, calculated lies. She closed her tired eyes and took a slow, deep breath. The ache in her chest was constant. It was a physical weight that she carried every single day. She looked around the spotless, empty kitchen. There were no scattered crayons, no mismatched socks, no sudden bursts of laughter from her 10-year-old twins. Chloe and Mia were gone. Robert had won. He always won. He had stood in that courtroom wearing his perfectly tailored suit and painted her as unstable. She remembered his cold, triumphant smile. She remembered how she had swallowed her screams just to keep the judge from thinking Robert was right. She had stepped back, giving up her own fight because Robert thrived on the war. She had thought foolishly that walking away from the battle would bring the girls peace. She thought her sacrifice would protect them from his endless need for control. Now she worked 60 hours a week at the architectural firm. She poured every ounce of her broken heart into blueprints and load-bearing calculations. It was her only escape. She took another sip of the bitter, cold coffee. She needed to leave for the office in 20 minutes. She needed to present a new design to a major client. She needed to pretend her life was not a hollow shell. Suddenly her phone vibrated against the wooden table. The sound was violently loud in the quiet room. She flinched, her heart skipping a heavy beat. She looked at the bright screen. It was an unknown number from a Seattle area code. Seattle was where Robert had moved the girls. Seattle was where her heart lived. Her breath caught in her throat. Robert never called. He had blocked her completely, enforcing a cruel, silent wall between her and her daughters. She reached for the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. "Hello?" Sarah answered, her voice barely more than a rough whisper. "Ms. A woman spoke, her tone steady but urgent. "This is Dr. Emily Thorne from the Seattle Children's Hospital. I am calling about your daughter Chloe." Sarah froze. The world tilted on its axis. The kitchen walls seemed to close in around her. Her daughter. Those 2 words felt like a sudden, sharp, physical blow. She had not been allowed to say those words out loud for 730 days. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking, her chest tight with rising panic. "Is she hurt?" "Chloe was admitted to our emergency department early this morning," the doctor said, pausing just long enough for the dread to settle in. "Her white blood cell count is critically low. We are running more tests, but we suspect acute myeloid leukemia." The air vanished from the room. Leukemia. Her sweet, quiet Chloe had cancer. The blueprints on the table blurred into grey smudges. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, struggling to remain upright. "I need you to come to Seattle immediately," Dr. Thorne continued, her voice cutting through the ringing in the ears of Sarah. "Chloe needs a bone marrow transplant. We will need to test you as a potential donor. Time is extremely critical." "I am in Portland," Sarah said, already standing up, already reaching blindly for her car keys. "I can be there in 3 hours." "Good," the doctor replied. "Ask for me at the pediatric oncology unit when you arrive." "And, Miss Sarah," the doctor paused, a heavy weight hanging in the silence. "I know the custody situation is complicated, but right now Chloe desperately needs her mother." Sarah dropped the phone into her purse. She did not call her boss. She did not care about the client presentation. She did not care about the mortgage or the job or the rules Robert had set. She walked out of the empty house and locked the door behind her. She had spent 2 years swallowing her pain to keep the peace. She had let Robert control the narrative. She had let him build a wall to keep her out. But that wall was coming down today. Her daughter was dying. The silent protest was over. She threw her purse onto the passenger seat and started the engine. The drive up Interstate 5 North was a grey, endless blur. She pushed the speedometer 10 miles over the speed limit. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel until her knuckles turned completely white. Her chest felt hollow yet heavy, with a rising, suffocating panic. Acute myeloid leukemia. The words echoed in her mind, repeating with every steady hum of the tyres against the wet pavement. Chloe was only 10 years old. She was too small, too quiet, too incredibly gentle for a battle like this. Sarah thought of Robert as the highway lines rushed past her window. She thought of his sharp, calculating eyes and his perfectly pressed suits. When they were married, his control had started as something small. It felt like care at first. He organised their calendars, he managed the finances, he told her what to wear to his firm dinners. But soon the walls had closed in completely. He dismissed her architecture firm as a silly hobby. He spoke over her at the dinner table, smiling to their friends while his hand gripped her knee, tight enough to bruise. If she argued, he punished her with days of cold, heavy silence. The silence was his ultimate weapon, and he wielded it with absolute terrifying precision. She remembered the invisible burden she had carried every single day, the constant, exhausting effort of managing his moods, smoothing over his harsh comments to the girls, and pretending everything was fine. She had been the emotional shock absorber for the entire family. But when she finally found the courage to leave, he did not just want a simple divorce. He wanted total, absolute annihilation. He hired an expensive expert, a man who wrote a fabricated psychiatric report, painting Sarah as erratic and completely unstable. Sarah remembered sitting in that cold, sterile courtroom. She remembered the hard wood of the defendant table under her shaking hands. She remembered the judge looking down at her, seeing a frantic, exhausted mother, and believing she was simply crazy. Robert had sat there calm and composed, the perfect picture of a stable, grieving father. He knew exactly how to play the system, and he played it flawlessly. She had swallowed her defence out of pure, desperate love. She had looked out into the hallway and seen Chloe and Mia sitting with a social worker, looking terrified and small. She knew a protracted, bitter war would destroy their childhood. So she made the hardest choice a mother could make. She stepped back. She accepted the unfair judgment, hoping her massive sacrifice would buy them a peaceful life. She truly thought Robert loved them enough to keep them safe. She thought she was doing the right thing, taking all the pain so they would not have to carry it. But the reality of his care was a complete illusion. Robert had moved them to Seattle immediately. He changed their schools and cut off all contact. Every birthday card she sent came back unopened. Every Christmas gift was returned to sender with black ink across her handwriting. For 2 years she had survived on old photographs and quiet, lonely prayers in the dark. Now her noble sacrifice felt like the biggest, most foolish mistake of her life. He was supposed to protect them, but he had missed the terrible signs. The doctor said Chloe had critically low white blood cells. How long had she been tired? How long had she been bruising while Robert was busy controlling their perfectly curated environment? The rain started to fall, hitting the windshield with sharp, angry taps. Sarah turned on the wipers. They moved back and forth, a rhythmic, ticking clock counting down the long miles to Seattle. She pressed her foot harder on the gas pedal. She had spent 2 years trying to be the bigger person. She had spent 2 years drowning in a silent, invisible burden, thinking it made her a good mother to walk away. But being a good mother did not mean disappearing into the shadows. It meant fighting the monsters, even if the monster wore a tailored suit. She thought about Chloe and her twin sister Mia. She remembered how Mia was always the brave one running ahead, while Chloe used to hide behind the leg of Sarah when strangers spoke to her. She remembered the sweet smell of their strawberry shampoo and the way Mia always held the hand of Chloe when they crossed the street. The thought of Chloe lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and strangers, made it incredibly hard to breathe. Sarah rolled down the window, letting the cold, damp air rush into the car to sting her cheeks. She needed to stay awake. She needed to stay perfectly focused. The days of keeping the peace were over, because the peace had nearly cost her daughter everything. The Seattle Children's Hospital loomed ahead, a massive fortress of glass and steel standing stark against the grey morning sky. Sarah parked her car in the crowded visitor lot, her hands shaking violently as she pulled the keys from the ignition. She ran through the sliding automatic doors, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She completely ignored the bustling lobby, following the brightly coloured signs pointing toward the paediatric oncology unit on the 4th floor. The elevator ride felt like an absolute eternity. The metal doors finally slid open, revealing a long hallway lined with cheerful painted murals of elephants and giraffes. The bright, playful colours were a cruel, jarring contrast to the pale, fragile children visible through the open hospital doors. Sarah hurried down the sterile corridor, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor until she reached the central nurse station. Dr. Emily Thorne was waiting, a tall woman in her late 40s with kind, weary eyes and her hair pulled back into a tight, neat bun. "Thank you for coming so quickly," the doctor said, her voice low and remarkably calm. "Where is Chloe?" Sarah asked, her own voice breaking completely. "I need to see her right now." Dr. Thorne gently placed a hand on the arm of Sarah, guiding her slowly down the busy hallway, stopping quietly outside room 412. "She was brought in at 3 a.m, the doctor explained softly. Robert thought it was just a lingering virus, but her white blood cell count had already dropped to dangerously low levels. He waited weeks. Sarah thought a wave of pure cold anger washing over her. She pushed the bitter anger down, focusing entirely on the heavy wooden door in front of her. Sarah pushed the door open, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The private room was cold, smelling sharply of harsh antiseptic and clean bleached linens. Chloe lay in the exact centre of the large hospital bed, looking impossibly small beneath the stark white sheets. Her dark brown hair the exact same shade as the hair of Sarah had been cut painfully short. Her skin was a pale, translucent grey, and dark purple bruises bloomed along her thin, fragile arms, right where the intravenous lines were inserted. A heavy, suffocating wave of profound grief hit Sarah, threatening to pull her completely under. 2 years. She had missed 2 entire years of her life. She had missed the sudden loss of baby teeth, the awkward, beautiful growth spurts, the quiet, comforting bedtime stories. The girl in the bed was taller, thinner, and covered in a dark shadow of pain that no 10-year-old should ever have to know. Sarah had stepped away to protect them from conflict, but her forced absence had left them entirely vulnerable to this terrible, invisible thief. She covered her mouth with her trembling hand, stifling a desperate, broken sob. The heavy emotional toll of realizing exactly how much time she had lost was absolutely crushing. Chloe turned her head slowly on the thin white pillow. Her dark eyes, usually so full of gentle, bright light, were clouded with absolute exhaustion and sudden raw fear. "It is okay," Sarah whispered, moving toward the bed with slow, extremely careful steps, as if approaching a deeply frightened bird. "I am right here, sweetie." "Who are you?" the weak, hoarse voice of Chloe asked. The innocent question tore a jagged, bleeding hole straight through the chest of Sarah. 2 years was a massive, empty chasm in the short life of a child. She had become a total stranger to her own flesh and blood. "My name is Sarah," she said, swallowing the massive, painful lump of absolute heartbreak in her throat. "I am..." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "I am your mother." Chloe stared at her for a long, quiet moment, her tired eyes searching the tear-stained face of Sarah. Then so quietly, Sarah almost missed it entirely. Chloe whispered, "Mommy." "Yes, baby," Sarah cried, the warm tears finally spilling over her cheeks, falling freely onto her sweater. "It is me. I am right here." The little girl blinked slowly, her pale brow furrowing in deep, painful confusion. "Daddy said you left," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling slightly in the quiet room. "He said you did not want us anymore." The cruel, heavy lie hit Sarah, harder than any physical blow ever could. Robert had not just kept them physically away, he had actively, purposefully tried to erase her deep love from their young, impressionable minds. She wanted to scream into the sterile air. She wanted to tear down the walls of the hospital, to find Robert in the hallway and make him answer for every single stolen day. Instead, she sat down in the hard plastic chair beside the bed. She reached out and gently took the small, incredibly cold hand of Chloe, in her own holding it like a precious, fragile lifeline. "I never left you," Sarah said, her voice incredibly steady and filled with a fierce, unbreakable truth. "I've been trying to come back to you every single day." Before Chloe could answer, before Sarah could wipe the warm tears from the pale cheeks of her daughter, a soft knock echoed through the quiet room. Dr. Thorne stood in the open doorway. Her face was tight, holding a new, urgent tension. Miss Sarah, the doctor, said, her voice a low, careful murmur. "Robert has just arrived on the floor. He brought Mia with him. He is currently standing at the front desk, and he is loudly demanding to know why security allowed you into the building." Sarah felt a sudden familiar chill settle deep into her bones. For 11 long years, that specific icy chill had been her absolute warning sign. It was the physical cue to retreat, to hide her feelings, to apologize for things she had never even done. It was the heavy, invisible burden of managing his explosive anger. But today, standing beside the hospital bed of her dying child, the chill was quickly swallowed by a hot, fierce fire of pure maternal instinct. "I will be right back, sweetie," Sarah whispered, pressing a gentle, lingering kiss to the warm forehead of Chloe. "I promise you I am not going anywhere." Sarah stood up, smoothing the deep wrinkles from her grey sweater. She took a long, steadying breath, filling her tired lungs with the sterile chemical air of the hospital. She walked out of the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind her, and stepped into the bright, busy corridor. Robert stood near the central nurse station. 2 entire years had passed, but he looked exactly the same. He wore a crisp, tailored navy blue suit. His posture was perfectly rigid and completely unyielding. He was adjusting the silver cufflink on his left wrist, a small nervous habit he only displayed when he felt his absolute control slipping away. He turned his head, and his dark, calculating eyes locked onto her. The familiar, suffocating wave of his heavy intimidation washed over her, but this time it did not pull her under. She did not lower her gaze. She walked directly toward him, her footsteps steady and deliberate on the polished linoleum floor. "What in the world are you doing here?" Robert demanded, his voice a harsh, low hiss. He kept his volume carefully controlled, designed entirely to keep the passing nurses from hearing his cruel tone. Sarah stood up perfectly straight, refusing to shrink back against the painted wall. "Chloe needs a bone marrow transplant," Sarah replied, her voice remarkably steady, carrying a calm authority she did not know she possessed. "Dr. Thorne called me this morning because I am a potential biological donor. You have a strict restraining order," Robert stated flatly. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, building a thick physical shield between them. "You are not legally allowed to be within 500 feet of my daughters. They are our daughters," Sarah corrected him, stepping 1 inch closer, invading his carefully constructed space. "And this is a life-threatening medical emergency. The legal restraining order does not apply when her actual life is at stake." The square jaw of Robert tightened visibly. A small muscle feathered rapidly in his cheek. He looked around the busy hallway, hating the simple fact that he could not command this specific environment. He was used to cornering her in their quiet kitchen, where no one could witness his emotional cruelty. Here, under the bright fluorescent hospital lights, his usual tactics were completely useless. Before he could issue another empty, hollow threat, Dr. Thorne walked over, holding a digital medical tablet to her chest. Robert, the doctor, said firmly, inserting herself smoothly into the tense standoff. Ms. Sarah is entirely correct. Washington state law allows biological parents immediate access in critical life-saving medical situations. We need to test all potential donors right now. That includes both of you, and ideally we need to test Mia as well. Robert shifted his weight, his dark eyes narrowing as he quickly calculated his next strategic move. He looked from the doctor back to the tired face of Sarah, searching for any sign of her old familiar weakness. Fine, Robert, said, his tone dripping with absolute ice. Test us. But if I am a match and I donate my marrow, I want a permanent written legal agreement today. I want Sarah to sign away her residual parental rights completely. No shared arrangement and no future visitation. Sarah felt the air violently leave her lungs. The absolute cruelty of his desperate demand was staggering. He was actually using the devastating illness of their 10-year-old daughter as a twisted bargaining chip. You cannot do that, Sarah whispered, staring at the man she used to love, wondering how he had become this complete, unfeeling monster. I can, and I will. Robert replied, a tiny, victorious smile playing at the sharp corners of his mouth. Those are my absolute terms if you want my help to save her. Dr. Thorne stepped directly between them, her calm professional demeanour shifting into something incredibly fierce and deeply protective. Robert the doctor warned, her voice dropping a full octave, ringing with unmistakable authority. What you are describing right now is illegal medical coercion. If you attempt to use the life-threatening illness of your daughter to manipulate a legal custody arrangement, I will personally report you to Child Protective Services and the Hospital Ethics Board immediately. Do you understand me? The confident, arrogant smile of Robert vanished completely. The colour drained slightly from his face. I am simply trying to protect my stable family, he muttered, looking away from the fierce, unwavering glare of the doctor. I am the reliable parent here. Sarah looked at him, feeling a sudden, profound shift inside her own racing heart. For 11 long years she had been absolutely terrified of his anger. She had twisted herself into knots trying to please a man who could never be satisfied. But looking at him right now, watching him back down like a scolded child, she did not feel any fear at all. She only felt a deep, overwhelming pity and a cold, absolute disgust. The invisible chains he had wrapped around her mind were finally snapping. Test me, Sarah said, turning her back on Robert, completely dismissing his presence entirely. Test me right now, Dr. Thorne. Do whatever you need to do, because saving Chloe is the only thing that matters. Sarah did not wait for his permission. She turned her back on the furious face of Robert and walked straight toward the testing laboratory. The bright fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Her footsteps echoed with a heavy, steady rhythm. She could hear the sharp, angry click of his expensive leather shoes following right behind her. He was furious, but he was completely trapped by the strict, undeniable reality of the hospital rules. He could not yell. He could not threaten her here. He had to follow her silently like a shadow stripped of its dark, heavy power. They entered the small, sterile waiting area of the laboratory. The room smelled strongly of rubbing alcohol and cold, bleached plastic. Sarah sat down on a stiff blue vinyl chair. She folded her trembling hands neatly in her lap. Robert chose a seat on the exact opposite side of the small room. He crossed his long legs and pulled out his sleek silver phone. He stared at the bright screen, typing aggressively, entirely refusing to look in her direction. The heavy, suffocating silence stretched between them. For 11 long years, Sarah had absolutely hated his cold silences. When they were married, a silence like this meant she had failed. It meant she had cooked the wrong dinner, or spoken too loudly at a party, or simply existed in a way that deeply irritated him. She used to scramble in the quiet, desperate to fix whatever she had broken. She would offer frantic apologies, pouring her own self-worth into the bottomless pit of his fragile ego. But today, sitting in the cold, bright light of the hospital, the heavy silence felt entirely different. It was not a punishment anymore. It was just an empty, hollow space. She looked across the room at him, studying the sharp lines of his jaw and the slight, arrogant curve of his mouth. He was just a man. He was a small, controlling man who wore expensive suits to hide his deep, terrifying lack of actual empathy. She felt a sudden, profound wave of absolute exhaustion, thinking about all the precious years she had wasted trying to make him love her. She did not want his love anymore. She only wanted her daughters. Sarah Hayes, a young, cheerful nurse, called out, stepping into the waiting area, holding a small plastic clipboard. Sarah stood up instantly, smoothing her grey sweater. Robert stood up too, sliding his phone into his tailored pocket. He adjusted his silk tie immediately, stepping in front of her, naturally assuming he would lead the way. Sarah did not step back. She did not yield her space. She walked right beside him, matching his wide, confident stride, completely refusing to be his quiet, obedient shadow. The small drawing room was bright and extremely clinical. The nurse directed them to sit in 2 large leather recliners, separated by a low metal cart covered in sterile medical supplies. Sarah rolled up the soft sleeve of her grey sweater, exposing the pale skin of her inner arm. The nurse, a kind woman with warm brown eyes, smiled gently at her. "We are going to run a rapid typing protocol," the nurse explained, tying a tight blue tourniquet around the arm of Sarah. "We are looking for a human leukocyte antigen match. It is a very specific genetic marker. If you are a match, we can begin the transplant preparations almost immediately." "Take as much as you need," Sarah whispered, staring intensely at the small, empty glass vials on the metal cart. "Just please find a way to save my little girl." "You will feel a small, sharp pinch," the nurse warned. Sarah closed her tired eyes. The needle pierced her skin. It was a sharp, tiny bite of pain, but it felt absolutely insignificant. She welcomed it. She wanted to bleed for Chloe. She wanted to pour every single drop of her own life force into those tiny glass tubes, if it meant her daughter would open her sweet, dark eyes and smile again. She watched the dark red blood flow steadily into the first vial. It was the colour of life, the colour of hope, and she prayed with every piece of her broken soul that it would be enough. Across the small room, Robert cleared his throat loudly. "How long will this entire process take?" he demanded, his tone sharp and deeply impatient. "I have important firm meetings to reschedule. I need a precise timeline." Sarah did not even look at him. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the red vials. He was actually worried about his corporate schedule while their 10-year-old child was fighting for her exact survival down the hall. The sheer, overwhelming selfishness of his question made her physically sick. "Preliminary results usually take a few hours," the nurse answered politely, carefully, removing the tight tourniquet from the arm of Sarah. "We are rushing this panel due to the critical nature of the admission. You should both have an answer by this evening." The nurse pressed a small white cotton ball to the arm of Sarah, securing it tightly with a piece of clear medical tape. "You are all done, Miss Sarah. You can go back up to the pediatric floor or wait in the cafeteria. We will call you the absolute second we know anything." Sarah stood up slowly, rolling down her sleeve. She felt lightheaded, but she knew it was not from the simple blood draw. It was the massive, crushing weight of the terrifying wait ahead. She walked out of the small lab, leaving Robert sitting in the leather chair, still complaining about his ruined daily schedule to the polite, trapped nurse. She walked slowly down the long, empty corridor. She did not want to sit in the cafeteria, surrounded by people eating sandwiches and drinking coffee, living their perfectly normal, oblivious lives. She walked back to the 4th floor. She found a quiet, uncomfortable bench at the far end of the hallway, just outside the heavy wooden doors of the intensive care unit. She sat down, pulling her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around her own legs. The palpable emotional distance between her and Robert was absolute. They were no longer a married couple. They were no longer partners in any sense of the word. They were just two separate people, tied together by a tragic, desperate medical emergency, waiting to see which one of them would be allowed to save the fragile, beautiful life they had created together. Sarah sat on the hard bench, her breathing slow and shallow. She watched the nurses move back and forth, holding clipboards and small plastic cups. Dr. Thorne stepped out of the intensive care unit and walked down the long, quiet hallway toward her. The doctor looked tired, but her kind eyes held a gentle, maternal warmth. "Mia is sitting in the family waiting room just down the hall," Dr. Thorne said, pointing toward a heavy wooden door. Robert went outside to take a long corporate phone call. He will be gone for at least 20 minutes. You should go see her, Miss Sarah. She is very frightened, and she needs her mother. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, a heavy lump forming instantly in her throat. She stood up, her legs feeling like heavy poured concrete. She walked slowly down the sterile corridor, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She reached the heavy wooden door of the family waiting room and took a deep, shuddering breath. She pushed the door open, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the metal handle. The room was small, lit by a single pale lamp in the corner. Mia sat on a large blue vinyl sofa, her thin legs pulled tightly up to her chest. She looked exactly like Chloe, with the same dark, beautiful hair and the same soft, expressive eyes. But while Chloe was covered in the visible dark bruises of her physical illness, Mia was covered in an invisible heavy armour of pure anxiety. She looked impossibly small and tragically guarded. Her small hands gripped the edge of her grey sweater, her knuckles completely white. Sarah felt a sudden massive wave of absolute sorrow wash over her. This was her brave, bold daughter. This was the little girl who used to lead the way down the slide, laughing loudly at the wind. Now she looked like a deeply frightened, cornered animal. "Hi, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice a soft, gentle murmur, exactly like the tone she used to use to wake them up for school. Mia jumped slightly, her dark eyes darting toward the open doorway. She saw Sarah and her entire small body went completely rigid. She pressed herself harder into the corner of the blue sofa, building a physical, desperate wall between them. "What are you doing here?" Mia asked, her voice completely flat and devoid of any childish warmth. Sarah felt the sharp, jagged pain of the question slicing right through her tired heart. She walked slowly into the room, making sure to keep her hands visible and perfectly relaxed. She did not rush forward to pull the little girl into a desperate, selfish hug. She knew Robert had spent 2 entire years building a fortress of ugly, calculated lies around this precious child. She needed to dismantle it brick by brick with total, unwavering patience. "I came because Chloe is very sick," Sarah explained, sitting down gently on the edge of the low coffee table directly across from the sofa. "And because I needed to see you. I have missed you so incredibly much, Mia." Mia looked down at her tightly clenched hands, completely refusing to meet the desperate, loving gaze of her mother. "You did not miss us," the 10-year-old girl said, her voice trembling with a sudden hot anger. "Dad told me the absolute truth. He said you left us because you were sick of being a mother. He said you chose your big office building over us." The air left the lungs of Sarah in a sharp, painful rush. The sheer, overwhelming cruelty of Robert was staggering. He had weaponized her successful career, twisting her hard work into a weapon of parental alienation. He had made her daughters believe they were entirely disposable. Sarah did not yell. She did not call Robert a liar, even though she wanted to scream the truth from the hospital roof. She simply took a slow, deep breath and leaned forward. "Mia, Sarah," said her voice dropping to a low, fiercely honest whisper. "Look at my eyes, sweetie. Please, just look at me for 1 second." Mia hesitated, her small shoulders rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. Slowly she lifted her chin, her dark, tear-filled eyes meeting the gaze of her mother. "I love you, Sarah," said, letting every ounce of her broken, bleeding heart pour into the 3 simple words. "I love you and I love Chloe more than anything in this entire world. I never ever chose my job over you. Your father and I could not live together anymore, but I never wanted to leave you. The judge made a terrible decision and your father took you far away from me." Mia blinked, a single warm tear escaping and rolling down her pale cheek. "But you never called," the little girl whispered, her voice cracking with years of heavy, carrying sorrow. "You never sent me a birthday present when I turned 10. I wrote you a letter every single week, Sarah," replied, her own tears finally falling, spotting her grey sweater. "I bought you the big set of coloured pencils you wanted, and I mailed them to your new house. I called the phone of your father every day, but he blocked my number. He sent all the letters back to me, Mia. I have them all sitting in a box in my bedroom waiting for the day I could finally show them to you." The thick, heavy wall around Mia began to crack. The little girl stared at her mother, processing the massive, conflicting truth. She had spent 2 years living in the cold, controlled world of Robert, learning to shrink herself, learning to never ask questions. But looking at the raw, undeniable love shining in the tired eyes of her mother, the cruel lies of Robert began to dissolve. "You really wrote to me?" Mia asked, a tiny, desperate shred of fragile hope entering her small voice. Every single week, Sarah promised, reaching out her trembling hand, leaving it resting gently on the cushion between them, offering a choice rather than forcing a heavy embrace. "I never stopped fighting for you. I just had to wait for a door to open, and now I am here. And I am not going to leave you alone again." Mia looked at the open hand of her mother. For a long, terrifying moment, the room was completely silent. Then, with a sudden, breathless sob, the little girl uncurled her tight legs and threw herself forward. She crashed into the chest of Sarah, wrapping her thin arms desperately around the neck of her mother. Sarah caught her, wrapping her arms tightly around the small, shaking body. She buried her face in the dark hair of her daughter, breathing in the familiar, sweet scent she had missed for 730 days. She held her fiercely, rocking her gently back and forth on the edge of the low table. The bond was incredibly fragile, damaged by years of terrible silent distance, but it was finally beautifully repairing. Sarah closed her eyes, letting her tears fall freely into the hair of her child, silently promising to completely destroy the cage Robert had built around them. They held on to each other, letting the missing years wash away in a flood of warm tears. Sarah stroked the dark hair of her daughter, feeling the small, fragile shoulders shaking against her chest. It was a moment of pure, stolen grace. But the grace was shattered instantly by the sound of heavy footsteps stopping abruptly at the open door. Robert stood in the doorway, his face twisted in a mask of absolute terrifying fury. He looked at Sarah, and then at the tear-stained face of Mia. His jaw clenched so tightly the bone seemed ready to snap. "What is going on in here?" Robert demanded, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register. Mia, step away from her right now. Mia flinched, the old fear instantly taking over her small body. She tried to pull away, but Sarah gently tightened her hold on the hand of her daughter. Sarah stood up slowly, keeping her physical body positioned squarely between Robert and the frightened child. "We are just talking, Robert, Sarah," said her voice completely calm and devoid of the panic he expected to hear. "You are manipulating her," he hissed, taking a sharp step forward into the small room. "I told you to stay away from them. I am going to call hospital security and have you physically removed from this building." Before he could reach for his phone, a polite, firm voice echoed from the busy hallway. "That will not be necessary," Dr. Thorne said, stepping into the tense, heavy atmosphere of the waiting room. The doctor held her digital tablet, her face completely unreadable and incredibly grave. She looked at the small, frightened girl, and then at the two warring parents. "Mia," the doctor said gently, "a nurse is bringing a tray of warm apple juice to the room of your sister. Why do you not go sit with Chloe for a little while?" Mia looked up at Sarah, seeking a silent permission she had never been allowed to ask for before. Sarah nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. Mia slipped past her angry father, her small sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor as she ran back toward the intensive care unit. When the little girl was completely out of sight, Dr. Thorne turned to Sarah and Robert. The gentle warmth was gone from her eyes, replaced entirely by a strict clinical urgency. "I need both of you to come to my private office right now," the doctor commanded, not waiting for an answer. Sarah felt a cold, sickening drop in the bottom of her stomach. She followed the doctor down the long, bright corridor, her heart pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Robert walked silently beside her, his angry posture completely rigid, his hands shoved deeply into the pockets of his expensive suit. They entered a small, cluttered office filled with thick medical books and framed colourful degrees. Dr. Thorne closed the heavy wooden door instantly, cutting off the constant beeping sounds of the busy hospital floor. She sat down behind her large metal desk and gestured for them to take the two plastic chairs in front of her. Sarah sat down, her hands trembling so badly she had to sit on them to keep them completely still. Robert remained standing, looming over the desk, projecting his usual arrogant authority. "I have the preliminary human leukocyte antigen results." Dr. Thorne began folding her hands neatly on top of her digital tablet. "We ran the rapid typing panel on both of your blood samples to determine your exact genetic compatibility with Chloe. Just give me the timeline for the surgery," Robert interrupted, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "I need to clear my entire schedule for the recovery period." Dr. Thorne looked directly into the dark, arrogant eyes of Robert, completely ignoring his heavy demand. "There is no timeline for a surgery today," the doctor said, her voice dropping into a somber, devastating tone, "because neither of you is a match." The sterile walls of the small office seemed to violently collapse inward. Sarah stopped breathing entirely. The cold, clinical words echoed in her mind over and over again. "Neither of you is a match. What are you talking about?" Robert demanded, his voice rising in sudden, genuine panic. "I am her biological father. Sarah is her mother. One of us has to be a match. That is how simple biology works." "Unfortunately, it is not that simple," the doctor explained, her tone remaining completely steady against his rising anger. "A parent is usually a half-match, which we can sometimes work with in specialized haploidentical transplants. But the specific genetic markers of Chloe are highly complex. Your markers, Robert, and yours, Sarah, simply do not align with her compromised immune system. If we transplant your marrow into her fragile body, her white blood cells will attack it immediately. It would be entirely fatal." Sarah felt a massive, crushing weight drop directly onto her chest. She had come here ready to bleed for her daughter. She had come ready to endure any physical pain, ready to lay down her own life to save the precious, beautiful life of Chloe. But her body, her own biological makeup, had completely failed her sick child. "Run the test again," Robert ordered, slamming his open palm down on the edge of the metal desk. "You made a mistake in the laboratory. I pay for the best premium health insurance in this entire state. Do your job and run the absolute numbers again," Dr. Thorne said firmly, completely unbothered by his aggressive display. "There is no mistake. We ran the panel twice to be absolutely certain. You are not a match for your daughter." The perfect, controlled mask of Robert finally cracked. He stepped back from the desk, his face draining of all natural colour. For the first time in 11 years, Sarah saw him completely powerless. He could not yell at the leukemia. He could not intimidate a microscopic genetic marker. He could not buy a sudden solution to save the fading life of his child. "What do we do now?" Sarah whispered, her voice, completely broken, tears spilling freely down her pale cheeks. "We have initiated a desperate search of the National Bone Marrow Registry," the doctor answered, looking at Sarah with deep, profound sympathy. "But finding an unrelated match can take many months. Chloe simply does not have months. Her white blood cell count is plummeting rapidly. Without a highly compatible donor, she will not survive the required chemotherapy conditioning. We are talking about a critical matter of days. We need a miracle, and we need it right now." Robert stared at the doctor, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. He could not accept the simple, devastating truth. He pulled out his sleek phone, his hands shaking slightly. "I am going to call the board of directors," he announced, his voice tight with rising panic. "I know people in this hospital, and I will get a specialist down here right now." He turned around and walked out of the small office, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him. The sudden silence in the room was absolute and incredibly heavy. Sarah sat in the plastic chair, her entire body feeling like cold, hollow lead. She stared at the floor, trying to process the terrifying reality. They needed a miracle, and she had absolutely nothing left to give. Dr. Thorne did not move. She waited until the angry footsteps of Robert faded completely down the long hallway. Then she leaned forward across her large metal desk. She closed the digital medical file on her tablet and looked directly at Sarah. The kind, weary eyes of the doctor were now filled with a deep, careful caution. "Ms. Sarah," the doctor said, her voice dropping to a very low, private whisper. "There is something else we need to discuss immediately. It is highly sensitive, and I needed Robert out of the room before I could tell you." Sarah looked up, her tired heart skipping a sudden, painful beat. "What is it?" she asked, her hands gripping the edge of the hard plastic chair. "Is Chloe getting worse?" "Chloe is stable for the moment," Dr. Thorne reassured her quickly, raising a calm, steadying hand. "But when we ran the rapid genetic panels, we had to map out the exact human leukocyte antigens. In doing so, we look at the entire chromosomal structure. We look at the exact biological inheritance from both parents." The doctor paused, taking a slow, deep breath. The quiet room felt suddenly charged with a strange, heavy electricity. "We found a major, undeniable discrepancy in the DNA of Chloe." The doctor continued, her voice incredibly gentle but entirely firm. "Sarah, the blood tests confirm that you are the biological mother. But Robert is not the biological father of Chloe." The words hung in the sterile air, completely impossible and absolutely absurd. Sarah stared at the doctor, her mind coming to a violent, screeching halt. She shook her head slowly, a nervous, confused sound escaping her tight throat. "That is completely impossible," Sarah said, her voice trembling with absolute certainty. "Chloe and Mia are twins. They were born on the exact same day. Robert is their father. We were married for exactly 10 years. I know this is incredibly shocking," Dr. Thorne replied, leaning closer. her tone filled with profound empathy. "But the genetic markers do not lie. We ran the test twice and we checked the blood types. Robert shares absolutely zero paternal DNA with Chloe." "But they are twins," Sarah repeated, her voice rising in a frantic, desperate plea for logical sense. "How can one twin belong to Robert and the other twin not?" "They are fraternal twins," the doctor explained carefully, using her hands to illustrate the rare medical concept. "This means 2 separate eggs were released during your ovulation cycle. What you experienced is an incredibly rare biological phenomenon. It is called heteropaternal superfecundation. It happens when a woman releases 2 eggs and has intimate contact with 2 different men within a very short, specific window of time, usually within 24 to 48 hours. Each egg is fertilized by a completely different man." The small office began to spin rapidly. Sarah gripped the armrests of her chair, trying to ground herself against the massive, rushing wave of pure shock. 2 eggs, 2 men, a short window of time. Her mind flew backward, violently tearing through 11 years of buried, painful memories. 11 years ago, she and Robert were engaged to be married. He had already started controlling every single aspect of their wedding, her career and her daily life. They had a massive, explosive argument about her architectural firm. He had demanded she quit her demanding job to be a proper stay-at-home wife. She had refused, and he had packed his bags, leaving their shared apartment in a cold, furious rage. He told her the wedding was completely off. Sarah remembered the absolute devastation of that dark weekend. She thought her life was completely over. She had gone to a local art gallery opening, seeking a quiet distraction from her breaking heart. And there, standing in the warm, ambient light, she had seen James. James was her old college boyfriend. He was kind, gentle, and entirely supportive of her big dreams. They had broken up years earlier, simply because their careers had taken them to different states. Seeing him that night, feeling his warm, easy comfort, had been a sudden, desperate lifeline. They drank wine, they talked about their lost dreams, and in a moment of pure, lonely vulnerability, she had gone back to his hotel room. It was a single, passionate night fueled by a deep need to feel entirely safe and truly loved. 2 days later, Robert had returned. He brought expensive flowers and offered a grand, sweeping apology. He promised he would change, and he promised he would fully support her career. Sarah, desperate for familiar stability, had taken him back. She had buried the memory of James deep inside her heart, never telling a single soul about her quiet, desperate mistake. 1 month later, she discovered she was pregnant with twins. Sarah gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The hot tears spilled over her cheeks, falling rapidly onto her grey sweater. James. The name echoed in her completely shattered mind. James was the father of Chloe. Dr. Thorne watched her waiting patiently for the massive shock to fully settle. "If we can find the actual biological father," the doctor said quietly, "we have a 50% chance of a perfect haploidentical match. That is the absolute best chance your daughter has to survive this week. Do you know who he is, Sarah?" Sarah nodded slowly, her entire body shaking with the terrifying, massive weight of the exposed truth. "Yes," she whispered, the tears choking her raw voice. "I know exactly who he is, and I have to call him right now." Sarah walked out of the small office, her legs feeling completely detached from her own body. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway seemed to pulse, beating in time with her racing heart. She needed to find a quiet, hidden place. She completely avoided the main waiting area, knowing Robert would be pacing there, demanding impossible answers from the exhausted nurses. She found a heavy grey fire door at the end of the corridor and pushed it open. The concrete stairwell was cold and incredibly silent. It smelled of stale dust and harsh cleaning chemicals. Sarah sat down on the top step, pulling her grey sweater tightly around her shaking shoulders. She held her phone in her trembling hands, staring blankly at the dark screen. 11 years. It had been 11 entire years since she last heard the warm, steady voice of James. She had married Robert, convinced herself she had made the safe, responsible choice, and completely buried the memory of that single, vulnerable night in the hotel room. Now that single night was the only absolute lifeline her dying daughter had left. She unlocked her phone, her fingers slipping slightly on the smooth glass. She did not even have his number saved anymore. Robert had insisted they delete all old contacts, claiming it was a necessary boundary for a healthy, committed marriage. She opened a blank internet browser, her hands shaking violently as she typed his full name and the name of his current architectural firm in Portland. The search results loaded instantly. There it was, a professional headshot of James looking slightly older, but still possessing those kind, gentle eyes. Below his picture was a direct office phone number. Sarah stared at the 10 digits, feeling a massive, suffocating wave of pure terror wash over her. What if he hung up on her? What if he was entirely angry, completely disgusted by the sudden massive intrusion into his peaceful life? He had no idea she had ever been pregnant. He had no idea he was a father, let alone the father of a 10-year-old girl fighting a desperate losing battle against leukemia. She closed her tired eyes and pictured the pale, bruised face of Chloe lying in that sterile hospital bed. The fear of rejection instantly vanished, replaced entirely by a fierce, undeniable maternal roar. The silent protest of her life was officially permanently over. She pressed the green call button and brought the cold phone to her ear. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Every single ring felt like a heavy physical blow to her tight chest. "Hello, this is James," a deep familiar voice answered, carrying a warm professional tone. Sarah opened her mouth, but the words completely lodged in her dry throat. She tried to breathe, but a sharp broken sob escaped her lips instead. "Hello," James repeated, his voice shifting instantly, picking up on the raw, undeniable distress. "Is someone there? Are you all right?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking, completely shattered by the massive weight of the moment. "It is Sarah." The line went entirely silent. The quiet stretched for a long, heavy moment, filled only with the faint, rhythmic sound of her own panicked breathing. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the devastating click of the hanging phone. "Sarah James," finally said his voice, dropping into a soft, completely stunned whisper. "Is that really you?" "Yes," she cried, the warm tears spilling freely down her face, splashing onto the concrete steps. "I am so incredibly sorry to call you like this out of nowhere. I know I have absolutely no right to disrupt your life. I know it has been 11 long years. You do not need to apologize." James interrupted his tone instantly, losing all professional distance, replaced by pure, genuine concern. "What is wrong, Sarah? You are crying. Are you hurt?" "I am not hurt," she said, taking a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to form the impossible heavy words. "But I have twin daughters, James. They are 10 years old. And my little girl, Chloe. She is in the hospital in Seattle right now. She has acute myeloid leukemia. She is dying, James." "Oh my God." James breathed the absolute shock and deep sorrow, entirely clear in his steady voice. "Sarah, I am so deeply sorry. That is completely devastating." But he paused, a gentle, careful confusion entering his tone. "How can I possibly help you?" Sarah gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning completely white. She looked down at the cold, grey stairs, gathering every single ounce of her remaining courage. "Chloe needs a bone marrow transplant to survive," Sarah explained. Speaking rapidly, terrified, she would completely lose her nerve. "I was tested today. Her father, Robert, was tested today. Neither of us is a match, but the doctors, they ran a deep genetic panel, James. They found a massive, impossible discrepancy in the DNA. She paused, letting the heavy, sterile silence of the stairwell surround her. She could hear James breathing on the other end of the line, waiting patiently, completely unaware that his entire world was about to permanently shift. The doctors explained it to me. Sarah continued, her voice dropping into a raw, absolute whisper. They said the twins have 2 different biological fathers. It is a very rare medical phenomenon. Mia belongs to Robert, but Chloe, James, the blood tests confirm that Robert is not her father. The silence on the phone became absolute deafening and incredibly heavy. Sarah James finally whispered, his voice completely raw, stripping away 11 years of distance in a single shattered breath. Are you telling me that your sick little girl is my daughter? Yes, Sarah sobbed, finally releasing the massive, crushing secret. She is yours, James. She is our daughter. And the doctors say if her biological father is tested, there is a 50% chance he will be a perfect life-saving match. She is running out of time, James. I am begging you. Please, will you come to Seattle? There was no hesitation. There was no anger, no cruel demand for an explanation, no defensive posturing like Robert always displayed. Tell me exactly where you are, James said, his voice entirely firm, filled with a sudden, absolute protective resolve. I am leaving Portland right now. I will be at the hospital in exactly 3 hours. Thank you, Sarah, wept, completely collapsing against the hard concrete wall. I am on my way, Sarah James promised, the line clicking quietly shut. Sarah lowered the phone, her entire body shaking with a massive, overwhelming wave of pure relief. She had finally spoken the terrifying truth. She wiped the hot tears from her face and stood up on the concrete steps. James was coming. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for the incredibly heavy, awkward meeting that awaited them. She pushed the heavy fire door open, stepping back into the bright, busy hospital hallway, knowing everything was about to completely change. Sarah walked back out onto the bustling 4th floor. The bright fluorescent lights felt incredibly harsh against her exhausted, swollen eyes. She checked the large digital clock on the wall. She had exactly 3 hours to wait. 3 hours of dodging the angry pacing form of Robert. She could not face him right now. She could not look at his tailored suit or listen to his demanding, arrogant voice, knowing the massive secret she now carried. She walked slowly toward the hospital cafeteria on the ground floor, needing a neutral, quiet place to wait for the man who held the absolute fate of her daughter in his hands. The cafeteria was large and smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. Sarah found a small round table in the far corner, near a large window overlooking the grey, rainy city. She sat down in the hard plastic chair, pulling her grey sweater tightly around her shaking body. She watched the rain hit the thick glass, tracing the slow, wet paths with her tired eyes. The minutes crawled by, heavy and agonizingly slow. She replayed the memory of James in her mind over and over again. She wondered if he would hate her. She wondered if he would look at her with the same cold, absolute disgust Robert always used. Exactly 3 hours later, the tall, familiar figure of James walked through the wide cafeteria doors. Sarah stopped breathing entirely. He looked older, of course. The dark hair at his temples was brushed with soft silver, and fine lines framed his kind hazel eyes. He was not wearing a stiff corporate suit like Robert. He wore a soft, dark blue sweater and worn comfortable jeans. He looked grounded, steady, and entirely real. He scanned the large, crowded room, his eyes moving quickly over the scattered tables. Then his gaze found her sitting in the dark corner. He did not hesitate. He walked directly toward her, his steps long and completely purposeful. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the round table for physical support. Sarah James said, his voice a low, warm rumble that sent a sudden, shocking wave of comfort straight through her chest. "James," she whispered, the tears instantly welling up in her red, exhausted eyes again. "Thank you for coming. I cannot believe you are actually here." He pulled out the plastic chair across from her and sat down. He leaned forward, resting his large, steady hands on the top of the table. He looked deeply into her face, seeing the dark purple bags under her eyes and the terrifying raw panic radiating from her entire body. "Tell me everything," James said, gently, completely ignoring the awkward, heavy gap of 11 lost years. "Tell me exactly what is happening to our little girl." The words poured out of Sarah in a broken, frantic flood. She told him about the sudden, terrifying phone call that morning. She told him about the dangerously low white blood cell count, the dark bruises on the fragile arms of Chloe, and the desperate, absolute need for a bone marrow transplant. She told him about Robert, about the cruel, fabricated custody battle, and how she had not seen her own daughters in 2 entire years. James listened in complete, stunned silence. His jaw tightened and a deep, profound sorrow filled his hazel eyes. But he did not interrupt her. He did not judge her for losing custody. He just listened, offering a quiet, steady grace she had not experienced in over a decade. Then Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath and reached the hardest part of the terrible story. She looked down at her shaking hands, unable to meet his steady gaze. "I did not know James." Sarah cried softly, her voice breaking under the massive weight of her lingering guilt. "I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea. I went back to Robert, and a month later I found out I was pregnant. They were twins. I just assumed they were his. I never ever would have kept a child from you if I had known the real truth." James closed his eyes for a long, heavy moment. He rubbed his hand over his face, absorbing the massive, life-altering shock. He had a 10-year-old daughter. He had missed her first steps, her first words, and a decade of beautiful, messy childhood. The grief of that lost time was clearly visible in the tight, pained lines around his mouth. But when he opened his eyes, there was no anger directed at Sarah. There was only a fierce, undeniable resolve. "You did not know," James said, his voice remarkably calm and incredibly firm. "You made the best choice you could with the information you had at the time. I am not angry at you, Sarah. I am just incredibly sad that she is hurting and that I was not there to protect her." Sarah let out a long, broken sob, burying her face in her hands. The deep, unexpected grace he offered her was completely overwhelming. She had spent years apologizing to a man who never forgave her, and now the man she had accidentally wronged the most was giving her absolute, unconditional forgiveness. "We cannot change the past 11 years. James continued, reaching across the table to gently touch her shaking arm. "But we can completely change today. Where do I need to go, Sarah? Where is the laboratory?" Sarah wiped her wet face, looking up at the steady, determined man sitting across from her. He was not running away. He was stepping right into the terrifying, chaotic storm to save a little girl he had never even met. "It is on the 3rd floor," Sarah whispered, standing up slowly, feeling a sudden tiny spark of real hope ignite in the dark, hollow center of her chest. "I will take you there right now." They walked out of the cafeteria together, leaving the heavy weight of the past 11 years sitting empty at the small round table. They walked toward the elevators, 2 completely broken people, united by a sudden, desperate mission to save their daughter. The elevator doors slid open on the 3rd floor. Sarah led James down the long, bright corridor toward the testing laboratory. Her heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She glanced sideways at James. He walked with a quiet, grounded confidence. There was absolutely no trace of the frantic, angry energy that always surrounded Robert. They reached the small, sterile waiting area. The same cheerful nurse from earlier was standing behind the reception desk, organising a stack of plastic clipboards. "Can I help you?" the nurse asked, her warm brown eyes darting between Sarah and the tall, unfamiliar man. "We are here for a rapid human leukocyte antigen panel," James said, his voice completely calm and entirely polite. "I am here to be tested for Chloe." The nurse nodded quickly, instantly, recognizing the urgent nature of the sudden request. She ushered James into the small, bright drawing room. Sarah followed close behind her, cold hands clasped tightly together in front of her grey sweater. James rolled up the soft sleeve of his dark blue sweater. He did not complain about the uncomfortable plastic chair. He did not check a cell phone or loudly demand a precise corporate timeline. He simply offered his strong, bare arm to the polite nurse. "You will feel a small pinch," the nurse warned gently, tying the tight blue tourniquet just above his elbow. "I do not mind at all," James replied, keeping his warm hazel eyes fixed completely on the exhausted face of Sarah. "Just take whatever you need to help her get better." Sarah watched the dark red blood flow steadily into the empty glass vials. A massive, overwhelming wave of profound gratitude washed over her. This man, a man she had not spoken to in 11 long years, was sitting in a sterile hospital room, bleeding for a sick child he had never even met. The nurse removed the needle and pressed a small white cotton ball against his skin. "The preliminary results will take a few hours," the nurse explained, labeling the glass tubes with incredible care. "We will page Dr. Thorne the absolute second the laboratory finishes the genetic sequence." The subsequent wait was pure, agonizing torture. Sarah and James found a quiet, secluded bench at the far end of the busy hallway, keeping far away from the heavy, angry presence of Robert. They sat side by side, the heavy hospital silence stretching out between them. The distant, rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors echoed down the hall. But unlike the cold, punishing silence of Robert, the quiet space with James felt entirely safe. He did not force her to talk or explain herself further. He simply sat with her, offering his steady physical presence as a strong, comforting anchor in the terrifying storm. As the long hours slowly crawled by, they began to speak in low, hushed whispers. James asked gentle, careful questions about the little girl fighting for her life. "Does she like to draw?" he asked, his eyes focused intently on the scuffed linoleum floor. "Yes," Sarah whispered, a sad, fragile smile finally touching her pale lips. "She loves to paint with bright watercolours. She is incredibly gentle, James. She is quiet and deeply thoughtful, exactly like you always were." James swallowed hard, his jaw tightening slightly, as he absorbed the beautiful, painful details of the daughter he never knew. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, processing the massive weight of a completely stolen decade. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor opened with a loud click. Dr. Thorne walked quickly toward them, holding her digital medical tablet tight against her chest. Her face was completely unreadable, her professional clinical mask firmly in place. Sarah stood up instantly, her tired legs trembling so violently she had to lean against the painted wall for physical support. James stood up right beside her, his tall frame completely rigid with sudden, terrifying anticipation. Dr. Thorne stopped directly in front of them, looking from the terrified eyes of Sarah to the anxious, hopeful face of James. "The laboratory just rushed the final genetic panel," the doctor said, her voice dropping to a low, completely serious tone. "The results are absolutely definitive." She looked directly into the wide hazel eyes of James. "The DNA confirms it without a single doubt," the doctor stated clearly. "You are the biological father of Chloe." The remaining air vanished from the long hallway. James closed his eyes, his broad shoulders dropping heavily as the massive, undeniable truth finally settled deep into his bones. He was a real father. The heavy, tragic weight of the lost decade crashed violently into his chest, but it was instantly swallowed by a fierce, overwhelming, protective love. And the human leukocyte antigen typing. Sarah asked, her voice cracking, completely unable to breathe, until she heard the final, desperate answer. Dr. Thorne finally allowed a small, genuine smile to break through her strict clinical mask. James is a 5 out of 10 match, the doctor announced, her voice ringing with a sudden, beautiful hope. It is a perfect haploidentical match. It is highly compatible for the complex transplant procedure. You are going to save her life, James. Sarah let out a loud, completely broken sob. Her knees entirely buckled, the massive, crushing terror of the past 12 hours finally leaving her exhausted, shaking body. James caught her right before she hit the hard floor. He wrapped his strong arms securely around her shaking shoulders, holding her tightly against his warm chest. He was crying too, his warm tears falling silently into her dark hair. He was a perfect genetic match. The silent, heavy, invisible burden Sarah had carried completely alone for so long was finally beautifully shared. Dr. Thorne gave them exactly 5 minutes to compose themselves. She stood quietly by the heavy fire door, allowing Sarah and James to breathe in the sudden, miraculous news. James slowly let go of Sarah stepping back, but he kept his warm hand resting gently on her shaking shoulder. We need to prepare for the harvest procedure right away, the doctor explained, her voice dropping into a soft, encouraging tone. But first, James, I believe there is a very brave little girl who desperately needs to meet you. James swallowed hard, his throat tight with overwhelming emotion. He nodded, completely unable to form the heavy words. Sarah wiped the warm tears from her face, using the soft sleeve of her grey sweater. She looked at James, seeing the absolute terror and profound love warring in his hazel eyes. He was about to walk into a sterile hospital room and meet a 10-year-old piece of his own soul for the very first time. They followed the doctor out of the quiet stairwell, stepping back onto the busy, brightly lit 4th floor. As they walked toward room 412, a dark, rigid figure stepped directly into their path. It was Robert. He had returned from his corporate phone calls, his face flushed with deep, lingering anger. He looked at Sarah, and then his dark, calculating eyes locked onto the tall, unfamiliar man walking closely beside her. "Who in the world is this?" Robert demanded, blocking the wide hallway with his broad shoulders. "And why is he walking toward the room of my daughter?" Sarah felt the familiar, heavy panic rise in her chest, but before she could speak, James stepped smoothly in front of her. He did not puff out his chest or raise his voice. He simply stood there, a solid, unmoving wall of calm, grounded energy. "My name is James," he said, his voice entirely even and completely devoid of the toxic aggression Robert thrived on. "I am here to help Chloe." Robert sneered, looking James up and down with absolute freezing contempt. "We do not need charity from a total stranger," Robert spat, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit. "I am handling the medical care of my family." Dr. Thorne stepped smoothly between the two men, holding her digital tablet like a physical shield. Robert, the doctor said firmly, her tone leaving absolutely no room for an argument. "James is the perfect genetic match. He is going to provide the life-saving bone marrow for Chloe. He has every single right to be on this floor, and I will not tolerate any disruption to the emotional well-being of my patient." The face of Robert went completely white. His jaw dropped slightly, the arrogant, controlling mask slipping entirely from his face. He looked from the steady, calm face of James to the tear-stained face of Sarah. He could not comprehend a situation where he was not the sole saviour or the ultimate authority. "Move aside, Robert," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly strong, carrying a quiet new power. "We are going to see our daughter." Robert stepped back, slowly, completely stunned into silence. Sarah did not look back at him. She walked past him, leading James to the heavy wooden door of room 412. Sarah pushed the door open gently, the soft, rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor greeting them. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp near the wide window. Chloe was awake, her small head propped up on a stack of thin white hospital pillows. She looked incredibly fragile, her skin a pale, translucent grey, but her dark eyes were wide and perfectly clear. "Hi, sweetie Sarah," whispered, walking softly to the edge of the large bed. "How are you feeling right now?" "I am very tired, Mummy." Chloe answered, her voice a small, weak rasp. "I know you are, baby," Sarah said gently, brushing a soft dark lock of hair from the warm forehead of her daughter. "But I brought someone very special to meet you." Sarah stepped back slightly, allowing James to move fully into the dim light of the room. James walked forward, his steps slow and incredibly careful. He stopped beside the metal bed rail, looking down at the tiny, fragile girl lying beneath the stark white sheets. The breath caught violently in the chest of James. Looking at Chloe was exactly like looking into a magical, heartbreaking mirror. She had his exact hazel eyes, the same soft, expressive brow, and the same gentle slope of his nose. The undeniable biological truth hit him with the force of a massive physical blow. This was his child. Chloe looked up at the tall, quiet man. She studied his warm, tear-filled eyes, completely unafraid. "Hello, Chloe," James whispered, his deep voice cracking under the massive weight of a decade of lost love. "My name is James." "Are you a doctor?" the little girl asked, blinking slowly against the harsh hospital lights. "No, sweetie," James answered slowly, sinking into the hard plastic chair beside her bed. "I am just a man who cares about you very much." Sarah watched them from the foot of the bed, her heart swelling until it physically ached. The contrast between James and Robert was absolutely staggering. Robert would have marched into the room loudly complaining about the slow nurses or the terrible hospital food. James simply sat there, radiating a pure, quiet warmth, completely focused on making a frightened child feel entirely safe. "Mummy said a special person was coming to help me," Chloe whispered, her heavy eyelids drooping slightly. "Are you going to fix my sick blood?" James reached out with a trembling hand and gently turned the small, cold fingers of Chloe with his own. His large hand entirely dwarfed hers, offering a physical, undeniable promise of absolute protection. "Yes," James promised, the warm tears finally spilling over his cheeks, falling silently onto the crisp white sheets. "I'm going to give you my healthy blood, Chloe. I'm going to do absolutely everything I can to make sure you get to go home and paint beautiful pictures again." Chloe smiled a tiny, fragile curve of her pale lips. "That is very nice of you, James," she murmured, her eyes finally closing in absolute deep exhaustion. "Thank you. You are so very welcome, my sweet girl," James whispered, leaning forward to press a soft, lingering kiss to the back of her small hand. He did not let go. He sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable plastic chair, keeping his gentle hold on his sleeping daughter. Sarah watched the beautiful tragic reunion, finally knowing deep in her absolute core that she was no longer fighting this massive, terrifying battle completely alone. Sarah stood in the quiet hospital room, watching James sitting by the bed of Chloe. A soft, gentle peace had finally settled over the space. But the fragile peace was shattered instantly when the heavy wooden door opened with a soft click. Dr. Thorne stood in the doorway, her face pale and deeply serious. She looked directly at Sarah and gestured silently toward the bright hallway. Sarah felt a sudden cold knot form in her stomach. She touched the shoulder of James lightly, silently, promising to return. She stepped out of the room, letting the heavy door close behind her. The fluorescent lights of the corridor seemed entirely too bright. Miss Sarah, the doctor, said, her voice dropping into a low, completely clinical whisper. "We need to step back into my private office. There is another critical issue we must discuss right now." "Is it about the transplant?" Sarah asked her, heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. "Is James no longer a match?" "James is perfectly fine," the doctor reassured her quickly, leading the way down the polished linoleum floor. "This is about your other daughter. This is about Mia." The air vanished from the lungs of Sarah. She followed the doctor into the small, cluttered office, sitting heavily in the hard plastic chair. Dr. Thorne sat behind her metal desk, pulling up a new digital file on her tablet. The kind, weary eyes of the doctor were now filled with a deep, unmistakable anger. "When Robert brought the girls in this morning," Dr. Thorne began, her voice completely steady, but carrying a sharp, heavy edge, "we ran a standard paediatric health panel on Mia simply because she was a sibling and a potential genetic donor. We just received the full results from the laboratory." Sarah gripped the edge of the metal desk, her knuckles turning completely white. "What is wrong with my healthy baby?" she whispered, her voice cracking with sudden raw terror. "Mia is not healthy, Sarah," the doctor stated, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the mother. "She is severely malnourished. Her body mass index is 15. For a 10-year-old girl, we require an absolute minimum of 16 for basic safe development. She weighs only 60 pounds. A child her age should weigh at least 70 pounds. Sarah stared at the doctor, her mind completely unable to process the terrible numbers. "But Robert has plenty of money," Sarah argued, a desperate, confused plea escaping her lips. "He is a successful partner at a major law firm. He lives in a massive, expensive house. How can she possibly be starving?" "Because starvation is not always about poverty," the doctor explained gently, leaning forward across the desktop. "Sometimes it is about absolute control. Her blood tests show severe vitamin deficiencies and a critically low iron count. These specific metrics do not happen overnight. This is the tragic, undeniable result of prolonged, systematic food deprivation." The small office began to spin rapidly around Sarah. The words echoed in her mind over and over again. Systematic food deprivation. She thought of Robert and his rigid, unyielding rules. She remembered how he used to control the grocery list, how he dictated exact portion sizes, claiming it was for optimal health. He had always been obsessed with appearances and strict discipline. "I spoke with a paediatric trauma specialist upstairs." Dr. Thorne continued, her voice heavy with deep professional sorrow. "They gently interviewed Mia while she was waiting in the family room. Mia described a highly controlled environment at home. She told the specialist that meals were completely conditional. Food was routinely withheld as a strict punishment if she misbehaved or if she asked questions about you." A hot, blinding wave of absolute rage hit Sarah, followed instantly by a crushing, suffocating guilt. Robert had starved her little girl. He had used basic human nourishment as a weapon of toxic psychological warfare. And Sarah had left them there. She had walked away believing the polished, respectable facade of Robert would keep them physically safe. She had sacrificed her own presence, thinking it would spare them from his explosive anger. But he had simply turned his quiet, terrifying cruelty directly onto them. He told her she had to earn her dinner by being a good girl, the doctor added, reading the tragic notes from her digital tablet. And being good meant completely pretending she did not have a mother. "She has been hungry and deeply terrified for 2 entire years." Sarah let out a loud, completely broken sob. She doubled over in the hard plastic chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. The massive, invisible burden she had carried for over a decade suddenly felt entirely different. It was no longer a heavy weight of personal failure. It was a dark, horrific realization of true domestic abuse. Robert was not just a difficult, controlling husband. He was a deeply dangerous, unfeeling monster, hiding behind expensive suits and a massive bank account. "I have to report this to Child Protective Services immediately," Dr. Thorne said gently, placing her hand softly on the shaking arm of Sarah. "It is the absolute law. Robert cannot take Mia home tonight. We are placing an emergency medical hold on her." Sarah sat up slowly, wiping the hot, angry tears from her pale cheeks. The crushing guilt was completely gone, replaced entirely by a fierce, undeniable maternal fire. The silent, peaceful woman, who always apologized, was officially, permanently dead. "You call whoever you need to call, Sarah," said her voice, dropping into a low, steady register of absolute power. "But hear me clearly, Dr. Thorne. That man is never touching my daughters again. I do not care what the old custody papers say. I do not care how many expensive lawyers he hires. He is never taking them away from me." Dr. Thorne nodded slowly, a deep, respectful understanding shining in her weary eyes. "I will file the emergency report right now, Sarah. You need to go back out there, and you need to find a very aggressive family attorney." "I will," Sarah promised, standing up from the plastic chair. Her legs no longer felt like heavy concrete. They felt incredibly strong, anchored by the massive protective rage burning in her chest. She walked out of the small office, stepping back into the bright hospital corridor, ready to completely dismantle the dark, toxic empire Robert had built. Sarah walked slowly down the bright, polished hallway. The fierce, burning anger in her chest was suddenly swallowed by a massive, suffocating wave of pure heartbreak. She stopped outside the small, quiet observation room where the nurses had moved Mia. She looked through the square glass window in the heavy wooden door. Mia was sitting cross-legged on the centre of the hospital bed. A small plastic tray holding a cup of apple juice and a few crackers sat on the thin blanket beside her. Sarah watched her 10-year-old daughter with completely new, terrified eyes. She did not just see a quiet, anxious child anymore. She saw the devastating physical evidence of absolute starvation. The grey sweater Mia wore hung loosely from her sharp, tiny shoulders. Her delicate collarbones protruded painfully against her pale skin. But the most shattering detail was the way the little girl was eating. Mia did not eat like a normal, hungry child. She looked around the empty room with wide, panicked eyes, as if expecting someone to suddenly rush in and snatch the tray away. She took a tiny, hurried bite of a cracker, chewing it rapidly and completely without joy. Then, with incredibly fast, practiced movements, she slipped 2 extra crackers into the deep pocket of her grey sweater. She was hoarding food. She was hiding basic nourishment, terrified she would not be allowed to eat again. The heavy, invisible burden Mia had been carrying completely alone crashed down onto the soul of Sarah. This tiny, beautiful girl had spent 2 years living in a constant, terrifying state of survival. She had been the quiet, hidden victim of the twisted need of Robert for absolute control. Sarah pushed the heavy door open, her hands shaking violently. The soft click of the metal latch sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. Mia flinched instantly, her small hands flying to her sweater pockets, desperately trying to hide her stolen crackers. Her dark eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, absolute terror. "It is just me." "Sweetie Sarah," whispered, stepping into the room with slow, incredibly careful movements. "You are not in any trouble, Mia. You are entirely safe." Mia relaxed slightly, but her thin body remained incredibly tense. She looked down at the plastic tray, her small fingers picking nervously at the edge of the thin blanket. "Is Dad coming back?" the little girl asked, her voice a small, trembling rasp. "He is going to be very angry with me, Mommy. I did not earn this food today. I was not perfectly quiet in the waiting room." The incredibly cruel, twisted logic of Robert broke the heart of Sarah into a million jagged pieces. She walked to the edge of the bed, the warm tears spilling freely down her pale cheeks. She sat down gently on the mattress, making sure to leave a safe, respectful distance between them. You never ever have to earn food. Sarah said, her voice dropping into a fierce, absolute vow. Food is not a prize, Mia. It is not a reward for being quiet or being good. It is something you always deserve to have, just because you are breathing and because you are a living, beautiful person. Mia looked up, her dark eyes filled with deep, painful confusion. But Dad said I cost too much money. The little girl whispered, a single tear escaping and rolling down her hollow cheek. He said I had to learn strict discipline so I would not end up lazy and selfish exactly like you. Sarah closed her eyes, absorbing the massive, toxic poison Robert had poured directly into the mind of their child. She reached out her trembling hands, slowly covering the small, cold fingers of Mia. She did not pull the little girl into a forced, desperate hug. She simply held her hands, offering a steady physical anchor of pure maternal love. "Your father was completely wrong," Sarah said, opening her eyes and looking directly into the frightened soul of her daughter. "He told you terrible, ugly lies because he is a very broken, deeply cruel man. But you are not going back to his dark house, Mia. The doctor is making sure he cannot take you home tonight, and I am going to fight him with every single breath in my body to make sure he never takes you away from me again." Mia stared at her mother, the heavy, terrifying wall of Robert finally, permanently crumbling. "You are going to fight, Dad?" the little girl asked, a tiny, fragile spark of real hope lighting up her exhausted eyes. "But he always wins, Mummy. He is too big and he yells so loud. He is not bigger than my love for you," Sarah promised, the hot tears falling onto their joined hands. "I was so incredibly scared of him for a very long time, Mia. I thought if I just walked away he would leave you alone and give you a peaceful life. It was the biggest, most terrible mistake I have ever made. But I am not scared of his loud voice anymore. I am right here, and I am not going anywhere." Mia let out a long, shuddering sigh, the massive tension finally leaving her thin, starving body. She leaned forward, resting her small head against the chest of her mother. Sarah wrapped her arms tightly around the fragile girl, pulling her close, resting her chin on the dark hair of her daughter. "I am so hungry," Mummy Mia cried softly, her voice muffled against the grey sweater. "I am always, always hungry." I know baby Sarah wept, rocking her gently back and forth in the quiet hospital room. "I am so deeply sorry I was not there to feed you, but I am making you a promise right now, Mia. You hear me? You will never ever be hungry again. I will fill your entire life with so much food and so much love that you will completely forget what it feels like to be empty." They sat together on the hospital bed, completely wrapped in the warm, fiercely protective embrace of a mother who had finally found her true voice. The silent protest was dead, and a new, unbreakable vow was born in the bright clinical light of the pediatric ward. Sarah waited until the steady, quiet breathing of Mia completely filled the small hospital room. The 10-year-old girl had finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, her thin fingers still loosely gripping a small plastic package of crackers. Sarah gently pulled the thin hospital blanket over the fragile shoulders of her daughter. She stood up from the edge of the mattress, completely leaving her heavy, tragic guilt behind her in the quiet room. She walked out into the bright, busy hallway, pulling her cell phone from the deep pocket of her grey sweater. She scrolled past the old blocked messages from Robert, completely ignoring his empty, toxic memory. She searched her digital contacts, her thumb scrolling quickly until she found the saved number for Rachel. Rachel was a fierce, brilliant family attorney, a woman Sarah had briefly consulted 3 years ago when the marriage first began to violently crumble. Back then, Sarah had been far too terrified to actually hire her. She had been too paralysed by the massive looming shadow of Robert and his endless threats of total financial ruin. But the dark shadow was entirely gone now, burned away permanently by the raw, undeniable truth of her starving child. Sarah pressed the green button, holding the cold phone to her ear. The line rang twice before a sharp, professional voice answered. Rachel speaking. The attorney said the background noise filled with the heavy sounds of a busy downtown office. Rachel Sarah said, her voice completely steady, carrying a calm, cold authority she had never used before. This is Sarah. I came to your office 3 years ago, but I was too scared to fight my husband. I am not scared anymore, and I need you to come to the Seattle Children's Hospital right now. There was a short, sudden pause on the phone. The sharp rustling of legal papers completely stopped. I remember you perfectly, Sarah, Rachel replied, her tone instantly dropping its formal distance, shifting into a highly alert, protective gear. Tell me exactly what is happening. Robert has been starving my daughter Sarah, stated the brutal, ugly words, tasting like absolute ash in her dry mouth. Child Protective Services is putting an emergency medical hold on her tonight. My other daughter is dying from leukemia, and Robert lied to the court 2 years ago to steal them both from me. I need to completely destroy him, Rachel. I need to take my children back today. I am leaving my office right this second. Rachel promised, the sound of her heavy office door clicking shut, echoing through the phone. I am bringing my private investigator with me. Do not speak to Robert, and do not sign a single piece of hospital paper until I get there. Sarah hung up the phone, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the sterile hospital air. She walked down to the crowded cafeteria, on the ground floor, buying 3 cups of hot black coffee. She sat at a large round table near the wide windows, watching the grey rain fall against the thick glass. She did not feel the familiar crushing anxiety that usually accompanied any thought of Robert. She only felt a cold, absolute, metallic focus. Less than an hour later, Rachel walked into the busy cafeteria. She was a tall, imposing woman in her late 40s, wearing a sharp, dark suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. Right behind her walked Paul, a quiet, broad-shouldered man with weathered skin and deeply observant, calculating eyes. Rachel sat down across from Sarah, placing her heavy briefcase firmly on the round table. Paul sat quietly beside her, pulling a small yellow notepad from his jacket pocket. Tell us absolutely everything, Rachel commanded, taking a slow sip of the hot black coffee. Start from the very beginning, Sarah, and do not leave out a single ugly detail. Sarah leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the hard surface of the table. She laid out the entire horrific nightmare. She told them about the fabricated, highly expensive psychiatric evaluation Robert had used to win sole custody 2 years ago. She explained the terrible, invisible domestic abuse, the strict conditional meals, and the severe, undeniable malnutrition of Mia. She told them about the sudden, terrifying diagnosis of Chloe and the absolute refusal of Robert to step back and let the doctors work. And there is one more thing, Sarah added, her voice dropping into a low, completely vulnerable whisper. A massive genetic complication. Robert is not the biological father of Chloe. An old boyfriend of mine is the father, and he is upstairs right now, preparing to donate his bone marrow to save her life. Robert will find out the absolute truth about the DNA very soon, and he will use it to paint me as a liar in open court. Rachel did not flinch. She did not judge the complicated, messy history. She simply narrowed her sharp, intelligent eyes, processing the massive puzzle of legal leverage. He can try to call you a liar, Rachel said, her voice ringing with a cold, absolute confidence. But a judge will not care about a decade-old complex biological anomaly when the legal father has been systematically starving a 10-year-old girl. Washington state law is incredibly clear on severe physical neglect. Paul tapped his pen against the yellow notepad, leaning slightly forward. Men who control their families with that level of extreme toxic precision, Paul said quietly, his voice a low, rough rumble, always control their bank accounts with the exact same twisted obsession. He views his family as his personal property. I guarantee you he is hiding massive, ugly secrets in his financial records. I want you to dig into every single part of his life, Rachel instructed the investigator, her eyes locking onto the steady face of Paul. Find the corrupt doctor who wrote that fake psychiatric report 2 years ago. Find every single hospital record from his new pediatrician. I want to know exactly how a rich, powerful lawyer manages to slowly starve his own daughter completely under the radar of the entire medical system. I will find every single piece of dirty paper he has ever signed, Paul promised, snapping his small notepad completely shut. I will tear his perfectly polished corporate life completely apart. Rachel turned her sharp, intense focus back to Sarah. She reached across the round table, placing her warm, strong hand directly over the cold, trembling hands of the mother. You are entirely safe now, Sarah, the fierce attorney said, her voice offering a massive, unbreakable shield of pure legal protection. Robert has operated in the quiet, dark shadows of your fear for way too long, but we are going to drag him directly into the bright, unforgiving light of a federal courtroom. He took your beautiful girls with a calculated, expensive lie, but we are going to take them back with the absolute devastating truth. 5 days later, the morning of the transplant arrived, bringing a cold, heavy grey dawn. Sarah walked slowly into the pediatric intensive care unit, her legs feeling like poured concrete. The past 5 days had been a complete waking nightmare. Chloe had endured the harsh, high-dose chemotherapy, a brutal chemical process required to completely wipe out her failing sick immune system. The physical toll on the fragile 10-year-old girl was absolutely devastating. Chloe looked smaller than ever, her pale skin completely translucent, her soft, dark hair falling out in small, tragic clumps onto the white hospital pillow. Sarah felt a massive, suffocating knot of pure terror in the very centre of her chest, knowing this dangerous procedure was the absolute only way to save her child. Down the long, bright hall, James was sitting calmly on the edge of a narrow hospital bed, wearing a pale blue surgical gown. Sarah walked into his small prep room, her cold hands shaking violently inside the pockets of her grey sweater. James looked up from the sterile floor and smiled, offering a warm, completely grounding expression. He was about to undergo a highly painful, invasive bone marrow harvest. He would be put under general anaesthesia, while surgeons used large hollow needles to extract the rich marrow directly from his pelvic bones. If Robert were sitting on that narrow bed, he would have complained bitterly about the terrible, drafty hospital gown or the slow, incompetent anaesthesiologist. Robert would have centred the entire medical crisis around his own personal discomfort, demanding endless praise for his minimal sacrifice. But James simply sat there, radiating a quiet, absolute strength. He did not ask for a single medal. He did not demand endless weeping gratitude from the terrified mother standing in front of him. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, her voice, a fragile, trembling whisper, echoing loudly in the quiet clinical room. "I am completely ready to give our little girl her entire future back," James answered, his deep voice entirely steady. He reached out, taking her cold, shaking hand and giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. He offered his steady physical comfort, completely anchoring her floating, panicked mind. The surgical team arrived, pushing his narrow bed down the long, bright corridor. Sarah walked closely beside him, keeping her hand wrapped tightly around his until they reached the heavy double doors of the main operating room. "I will see you soon," James promised, his warm hazel eyes locking onto hers right before the heavy doors swung completely shut. The surgical waiting room was a completely terrifying, sterile space. Sarah sat down on a hard blue vinyl chair, pulling her grey sweater tightly around her shaking shoulders. Every single rhythmic tick of the large wall clock felt like a physical heavy blow to her exhausted heart. She was entirely vulnerable, completely stripped of all her usual careful defences. For 2 long years she had survived by violently swallowing her fear, burying her emotions to keep the toxic peace with Robert. Now, sitting in the quiet, empty room, she simply had to let the massive crashing waves of pure terror wash entirely over her. She leaned forward, burying her tear-stained face in her hands, praying quietly to a universe she had completely doubted for a very long time. After 2 agonizing, endless hours, Dr. Thorne finally walked through the swinging doors, still wearing her light green surgical scrubs. The bone marrow harvest was a complete, beautiful success, the doctor announced, a tired but deeply genuine smile touching her professional face. James is resting quietly in the recovery room, and his vital signs are perfectly fine. We retrieved more than enough healthy, rich stem cells. We are taking them to the room of Chloe right now. Sarah jumped up from the hard chair, her heart leaping with a sudden, brilliant spark of real hope. She hurried back to room 412, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished linoleum floor. The actual transplant procedure was not a massive dramatic surgery for the little girl. It was simply a slow, careful intravenous infusion of the healthy marrow from James. Sarah sat down in the hard plastic chair beside the bed, completely holding her breath. She watched the thick red liquid travel slowly down the clear plastic tubing, dripping steadily into the fragile, bruised vein of her exhausted daughter. It was the absolute, undeniable gift of life. It was flowing directly from a father, who had just learned he was a real father, straight into the sick body of a little girl who desperately needed a massive miracle. Later that quiet afternoon, the heavy wooden door opened slowly. James walked stiffly into the dim room of Chloe. He moved with extreme care, clearly in deep physical pain from the invasive lower back extractions, but his hazel eyes were incredibly bright, shining with a profound, beautiful peace. He sat down heavily in the empty chair, right next to Sarah, their tired shoulders gently touching in the quiet space. They sat together in comfortable, healing silence, watching the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of the small chest of their sleeping daughter. The silence between them was not a cold, empty, punishing void like the silence of Robert had always been. It was a shared, beautiful space of profound, unspeakable hope. "We actually did it," James whispered, his voice thick with heavy, raw emotion, leaning his head back against the painted wall. "You did it," Sarah corrected him, the warm, happy tears finally spilling freely down her tired face, washing away the terrible fear of the morning. "You saved her life today, James." The peaceful silence in the dim hospital room lasted for exactly 2 hours. Sarah watched the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of the small chest of her daughter. James sat quietly beside her, his tired eyes closed, his deep breathing slow and perfectly even. The heavy, terrifying storm of the massive transplant procedure was finally over, but the dark, looming clouds of Robert were still gathering, waiting just outside the hospital walls. A soft, hesitant knock broke the quiet stillness of the room. Dr. Thorne pushed open the heavy wooden door. Her face was completely devoid of the warm, triumphant smile she had worn earlier. She looked directly at Sarah, her eyes completely serious, and she gestured silently toward the bright hallway. Sarah felt a sudden, freezing drop deep in the bottom of her stomach. She stood up very carefully, making absolutely sure not to wake James or Chloe. She walked out of the quiet room, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The fluorescent lights of the long corridor buzzed with a low, annoying hum. "We need to talk." "Dr. Thorne," said her voice, dropping into a low, completely clinical whisper. "We need to step into my private office right now." "Is it the new marrow?" Sarah asked, a sudden frantic panic rising rapidly in her tight throat. "Is her fragile body rejecting it already? Chloe is perfectly fine." The doctor promised, quickly leading the way down the polished linoleum floor. She is resting beautifully, and the cellular infusion is going exactly as we planned. This is about the final genetic panel we ran for Mia. Sarah followed the doctor into the small, cluttered office. She sat down heavily in the hard plastic chair. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach, bracing her tired body for another massive, crushing blow. Dr. Thorne sat behind her metal desk. She did not open her digital tablet. She simply folded her hands together and looked directly into the terrified eyes of Sarah. When we ran the deep chromosomal mapping to figure out the exact parentage of Chloe, the doctor explained we had to process the blood work of Mia at the exact same time. We had to know if she was a potential sibling donor, and we had to establish the complete biological baseline. The final laboratory results came back 10 minutes ago. Sarah completely stopped breathing. She waited, the sterile air of the small office feeling incredibly thick and incredibly heavy. The rare medical phenomenon is entirely confirmed, Dr. Thorne stated, her voice steady and incredibly firm. Mia shares exactly 50% of her DNA with Robert. There is absolutely no genetic discrepancy there. Robert is the true biological father of Mia. The heavy words hit Sarah with the violent, sudden force of a physical blow. She closed her eyes, her exhausted mind spinning rapidly through the terrifying, dark implications. One twin belonged to James. The other twin belonged to Robert. It was a chaotic, impossible biological miracle, but it was also a massive, terrifying legal trap. "He's going to use this," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with absolute, undeniable certainty. "He is a very powerful, very calculating corporate attorney. He knows exactly how the broken family court system works. He will use his biological DNA as an unbreakable heavy metal chain to keep her permanently trapped in his house." Dr. Thorne nodded slowly, her face filled with deep professional sympathy. "The Child Protective Services team has placed the emergency medical hold," the doctor said. "He cannot take her home today or tomorrow, but Washington state law places a massive heavy emphasis on biological parental rights. He will march into a federal courtroom and he will loudly demand his biological daughter back." "But he is starving her," Sarah cried, the hot, angry tears spilling over her pale cheeks, splashing onto her grey sweater. "He is using simple food as a cruel, twisted punishment. He told her she does not even have a real mother. How can a smart judge possibly give a fragile, starving child back to a complete monster just because they share the exact same blood?" "Because he will lie," the doctor answered, stating the ugly, cold truth of the legal system. "He will hire incredibly expensive, aggressive lawyers. He will look at the judge and say she is simply a picky eater. He will say the emotional trauma of the cancer diagnosis caused her to lose weight. He will spin a brilliant, flawless narrative, and he will use his biological paternity as his ultimate absolute shield." Sarah stared at the blank painted wall of the small office. She felt a sudden terrifying chill settle deep into her weary bones. Robert did not actually love Mia. He did not look at Mia with the same pure, desperate love that James had shown for Chloe. Robert only viewed Mia as his personal, expensive property. She was a living, breathing extension of his absolute control. Losing total custody of Mia would mean losing his perfect, carefully curated public image. He would completely destroy Sarah, and he would completely destroy the little girl before he ever let them walk away. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping into a low, fierce whisper. "You fight him," the doctor replied, leaning forward across the metal desk. "We document every single missing pound on her tiny frame. We document the deep psychological terror hiding in her dark eyes. I will personally testify in open court, Sarah. I will swear under oath that this child is the tragic victim of severe, deliberate physical neglect. But you have to be completely ready for the most brutal, ugly fight of your entire life. I am completely ready, Sarah vowed, standing up slowly from the hard plastic chair. Her tired legs did not shake. Her cold hands were completely still. The invisible burden she had carried for over a decade was permanently gone. It was replaced entirely by a massive burning armour of pure maternal rage. She walked out of the small office, stepping back into the bright, busy hallway. She walked straight to the quiet observation room where Mia was sleeping. She looked through the square glass window. The 10-year-old girl looked so incredibly small, buried entirely under the thin white hospital blankets. Biology does not make you a real father, Sarah thought, staring intensely at the fragile, sleeping face of her daughter. James had proven that beautiful truth today. James had gladly bled for a child he never knew, offering pure, unconditional life. Robert had used his biological power to slowly, systematically crush the beautiful spirit of a little girl, simply to feed his own massive, fragile ego. Sarah placed her hand flat against the cold, heavy glass of the door. She made a silent, unbreakable promise to the sleeping child. Robert was going to fight with all of his massive wealth and all of his dark, twisting lies. But he had completely underestimated the absolute terrifying power of a mother who had finally found her true voice. She was going to break his heavy biological chains, no matter what it cost her. Sarah did not even have the time to pull her hand away from the cold glass of the door. The heavy, sharp sound of aggressive footsteps echoed loudly down the bright corridor. She turned slowly, her grey sweater brushing against the painted wall. Robert was marching directly toward her, his face a terrifying dark shade of absolute fury. He was gripping his expensive silver phone so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He had just spoken to his high-priced corporate lawyers, or perhaps he had cornered a terrified nurse to demand the medical charts. Whatever the source, the devastating absolute truth had finally reached him. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from her, completely invading her physical space. For 11 years, this specific towering posture would have forced Sarah to look down at her shoes, offering desperate, frantic apologies just to calm his raging storm. Today, she simply tilted her chin up, looking directly into his cold, furious eyes. "You lied to me for 10 entire years," Robert hissed, his voice trembling with a violent, unhinged rage. He did not care about the quiet hospital rules. He did not care about the sleeping sick children just behind the heavy wooden doors. "You are a disgusting, manipulative liar, Sarah. You slept with another man, and you let me raise his bastard child in my own house." Sarah felt a sudden massive rush of pure adrenaline. She did not flinch. She did not lower her steady gaze. "I did not know," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a cold, absolute calm that completely mirrored his burning anger. "It was a single mistake, Robert. It happened when you threw your ring at me and walked out the door because you wanted to control my entire career. I went back to you, and I genuinely believed they were both your daughters. Do you honestly think a federal judge will believe that convenient, pathetic story Robert demanded, stepping 1 inch closer